Good afternoon, everyone. We're here to launch or talk about Professor Philip Tew's third published novel. As I'm sure most of you know, if not all of you, he's a Dr. Philip Tew. He's Professor of English Literature at Brunel University, who are kindly hosting this launch. And of course, he's successfully published more than 20 non-fiction books or articles. And he, in the last sort of 2 years, has managed to have his novels published. He's been writing novels for quite some time, as may become apparent during the talk. And it's only been in the last 2 years that he's had some success. I'm another writer with Brigand, but because the managing director's not a keen public speaker, he often pushes me forward to speak on Brigand's behalf. So I'm grateful on behalf of Brigand to be here today. So we're here to talk about a book titled Clark Gable and His Plastic Duck, which is a fascinating name in itself. And it's also got a very, of course, I'm bound to say this is sort of, if you like, part of the publishing team. It's got a marvelous cover too. So we're going to find out a bit more about what's inside it. What we propose is that we have 3, possibly 4 readings, just seeing how time goes. I've got some questions prepared, which I will put to Phil. I'm going to call him Phil from now on, not Professor Philip Tew, if you don't mind, because I know him on a personal level. We'll put the questions to Phil. But if you, the audience, dare I call you, if you, the audience, have got questions, then I think we'll give preference to them, because you're not just here to sit in silence and listen to me. And I realise I've spoken for long enough. So let's get started. I'll hand you over to Phil, and he's going to start, I believe, with a reading from the book, which is, if you've got a copy of the book, pages 117 to 118. Unless you want to say something general about the book first, Phil.
Yep, just one small correction, Pete. This actually is my second novel, but my third published book of fiction. The second book was 3 novellas, which was entitled Fragmentary Lives, and the first novel, Afterlives.
Yeah, forgive me for that, Phil.
That's all right. That's all right. Second published novel. I shall begin with the reading, because I think it will settle me down and give people a flavour of the book. This book is set in the early 1990s, but much of its action, it has a kind of retrospective action, takes place in the early 1970s, and some of the episodes of memory take place even before that. And this is one of the ones from childhood for the main character, Bill Tew. He, like me, comes from Enfield, but this character is not me. In fact, my alter ego, as you may know, some of you, from my first novel, Afterlives, my alter ego is Jim Dent, who is from Enfield. Like Bill Tew, both of them working class boys who've gone to grammar school for various reasons that maybe I can discuss later with Pete. Bill Tew, the protagonist of this novel, absolutely detests Jim Dent by the time they reach adulthood, having once been good friends, but that's another story. So this is the beginning of a chapter where the character is looking backwards, as he often does. He's very passive, and that's one of his qualities. Again, quite unlike my character, Jim Dent, who's much more active and interventionist. And I'll begin. Thinking of exactitude concerning the matter of ill-advised words and the kind of curiosity that led me to want to understand the wider adult world with its innate strangeness, an episode from childhood comes to the surface when, aged about 9 or 10, with 2 female cousins, I played a trick on our immediate families on Christmas Day. In the bosom of my extended family, we were gathered in my aunt and uncle's flat of post-war vintage over in Enfield Town on Baker Street, set back from the road. The turkey dinner had settled, mince and cocktails were taken as the afternoon progressed slowly. As was the case in that period, rather improbably, BBC television had closed down for the afternoon. Just imagine. We watched The Glass Mountain on a film playing on ITV. Very soon, we kids were all bored shitless, yet the adults seemed mesmerised by the soaring renditions of operatic singing we found so dull. In a huddle behind their leatherette sofa, we came up with a plan to trick the adults by leaving their brand new reel-to-reel Grunded tape recorder out of sight after the film had ended, but primed and still running. Gradually, their conversation ensued after the TV was silenced for taking tea and turkey sandwiches. Our strategy captured it all: various family disputes, the snide asides when someone left the room, the long silences punctuated by our grandmother snoring, and the counterpoint of words used illogically, full of non-arguments, various non-sequiturs, and silly ideas. It was a typical white working class family of the period. As a group, they were variously ill-informed, ill-educated, highly opinionated, capable of cruelty, vindictiveness, and compassion, being prejudicial about each other, tetchy, and humorous all at once. Everything was played for posterity over cold turkey sandwiches. Everyone else was horrified. We were gratified but scolded soundly, and the tape was rewound for reuse for another recording. Our grandmother denied her cutting statements. Even my father was riled by his obviously uncomical inanities, interspersed with cutting asides that were simply insults, like calling his own mother a stupid fat cow during her second trip to the loo. She said far, far worse about the other guests, but was only obsessed by her son's slight. My own astonishment was at the banality of the recorded words, their incoherence at times, their overwhelming mediocrity, a sense that the world would easily be better off without all this vapid nonsense. And yet I had a growing conviction that the noise was purely Darwinian rather than the words being specifically expressive, all about power and hierarchy, a struggle to be heard for its own sake, nothing much more. My uncle wiped it all from history, although it was no great loss. Every single sentence was simply vacuous crap. That's it. First passage.
Okay. Well, when we talked about the readings, I came up with a question following that extract, which I told Phil I found very interesting. I guess because I come from a white working class background myself, and so if anybody's got something to raise from the reading, is there a way of you letting us know? Would you like to ask a question, or I could put my question to Phil? Perhaps I'll put my question to Phil. Having read both of his earlier works, I should say, so I read the first novel, Afterlives, and also the 3 novellas in Fragmentary Lives, and now this one. There is a sort of continuous. Hi, Neil. There is a continuous sort of thread that runs through his books, and I think it's all to do with his background. And that is that he seems to be very conscious of the disappointed, unfulfilled lives of former grammar school schoolboys. And Bill Tew and Jim Dent, although Jim Dent is Phil's alter ego, Jim Dent hasn't in the stories gone on to enjoy Phil's career or fulfillment. But both Bill Tew and Jim Dent seem to be lads who have gone to grammar school and then don't find much fulfillment or satisfaction in life. This is really clear in Bill Tew, and it struck me as odd because, of course, in public discourse these days, we hear a lot about how the grammar schools were wonderful institutions, giving people from all different backgrounds opportunities. and that because, and so, you might hear some people say, oh, we won't get a working class prime minister ever again, or one with a working class background, because they don't have the access to the higher echelons of universities like Oxbridge, because there are no longer grammar schools. And so it strikes me as odd, this sort of thread in Phil's book. So is it something you consciously include, Phil?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it struck me that the grammar school process was the one that gave you a great deal of opportunity, but it also, it was a funneling. It funneled you into a specific kind of educative process. You know, it was very much a kind of academic model rather than any kind of practical or scientific model. Although they taught sciences, it wasn't like the technical schools that you get in Germany and on the continent. That was quite unusual in Britain, and I think that a lot of people were taken out of their comfort zone, and they didn't totally adapt to the new circumstances. So I think for those kinds of people, it was a double-edged sword, to use the cliche. It was something that was both an opportunity and but also offered a great deal of negativity. And because when I graduated in about 1976, there was a great deal of graduate unemployment. So it was pretty obvious that the people that struggled most for jobs were those who were not entirely, but many of them from the working class backgrounds, because they didn't have the facility with the world that they were entering that the others perhaps did, if that makes any sense. And it was always a bit of a divided kingdom, the grammar school. I remember talking to Jim Crace, who went to my school, Jim Crace, the novelist, and he recognized this instantly, that there were two kinds of blazers at school. There was the rough and ready blazer, the cheap one, and then there was the much more expensive one that was made from barathea, a kind of much lighter, posher kind of cloth. And most working class kids at school wore the cheap blazer, at least initially. I kind of worked out that this was significant, and I pestered my parents like mad for that barathea blazer, the posher one, which I eventually obtained. But I think most people like Bill Pugh would have carried on with their kind of itchy, scratchy, cheap version, because their parents wouldn't have seen the merit in wasting a great deal of money on a blazer that just looked a bit nicer. So, you know, yeah, I think that signified the different worlds within the school that were echoed in our experience afterwards to some degree, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Has anybody else got any comment regarding that subject? Or
James, go on.
Could I make a point about the use of the tape recorder in that section, please?
Yeah.
Hi, Phil. It's James Riley here. How are you?
I'm fine, and you?
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed that passage. Thank you. It really reminded me of the way that William Burroughs talks about the tape recorder, a device that can reveal what people really think and reveal what people are actually really thinking below the surface. And the scene really reminded me of the way that he described setting up a tape recorder in his flat and he's in his room when he was receiving guests, and they didn't know it was recording, and he would just allow all their sort of chatter to be recorded, and he would then work on that later on to find out what they were really thinking. It very, very similar, and it was very interesting the way you put that together. I was just curious whether you had any of those kind of sound experiments or sound art ideas in mind when you were writing that scene.
No, it actually came from real experience. My cousin was the main perpetrator, and she decided that she would play this trick on the adults. And of course we just had this great fascination. This was in the mid-60s, with none of us had seen technology like that at that point. You know, it was all kind of new and just quite alien to us. So we were amazed that it could capture everything, every sound, every nuance, as far as we were concerned. And then, of course, you had the absolute denial on the part of the adults that this was something they'd said. So there was this disjuncture between this kind of ability to technically capture an aspect of reality and the conscious denial of it by those who'd taken part in it. But yeah, I mean, I had some notion that that there'd been sort of some use of it in you know, the avant-garde. This is not at that point, but I had some notion that there was a use of it in the avant-garde in the 1960s. Even in Britain, I think there were some people. Was it Bob Cobbing? Taped all sorts of sounds and.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, tape loops and
yes,
and distorting speech and adding noise and things like that. Very true.
So it seemed to be quite apt, if you're looking back to the 60s, that the tape recorder captures something of this new kind of amazing technology that we now take for granted. You know, that it reminds me of that opening sequence in Doctor Who with the swirly screen and the strange music, this sort of experimentation somehow. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. Thank you.
No. Okay, well, we're almost 20 minutes into the session, so let's move on to the second reading, Phil, which is from page 51 to 52, I believe.
Okay. This is about the antagonist of Bill Pew's. He has a school friend called Conrad, or Connie, who is the kind of person that cheats at cards and indulges his himself in all kinds of ways. It's based on a few people that I've known over the years. He is a sort of Jack the Lad, I suppose. Some people might call him, and he again comes from a kind of curious marginal background where his family are quite wealthy, but they're slightly dodgy, as they used to call them. And he's visiting Bill on a weekend, having not been seen for years and years and years, bringing with him his new wife. As the newlyweds trudged behind me upstairs to my flat, our unaccustomed muscles flexed in struggling with their cumbersome baggage in various containers. It became evident from his demeanour that Connie was more than slightly pissed, already swaying. Likely he was well oiled from imbibing a few tumblers of his mother's scotch over breakfast, a freebie top-up while staying at her new place in a suburban commuter town, a walk and 3 stations from our old school. It seemed a little early for Dutch courage taken for the long journey home. So maybe instead it was imbibed in anticipation of seeing me, to be convivial. Connie followed me into the flat itself, stumbling into the threshold as casually as if the place was his very own. Connie's old man had died a few years back, leaving his building firm to both sons and their mother. In recompense, the latter and Connie had been bought out, presumably given a hefty wedge for each by Malcolm, after which the older brother sold off the whole lot, yard included, for yet more moolah, and absconded, reportedly travelling to the Costa del Sol. The whisper was that he'd done a farewell job to boost his spondulics, but his record remained spotless, no conviction to his name. Connie called him the Teflon Man. At that point, a rudderless Connie drifted, frittering away part of his inheritance on low-life pursuits. He suffered a phase of seemingly genuine, if unexpected, grief at his father's demise. After a shot at a career that hadn't lasted long, and constant arguments with his mother while staying in a new house, excuse me, he dropped off the radar for several years, not a dicky bird from him in over a year. Connie had sent no letters nor postcards. He rang me once, late one night, very drunk, almost incoherent, and without an idea of where he was. Well, there's a harbour, he slurred. Lots of fucking sailing boats. Hot, it's fucking hot here. The phone had gone dead. Being August, it could have been anywhere, Bermuda or Brixham or even Lake Bolaton. All I know was a woman was involved that night. His call was one of those, shall I tell her I love her ones, but too pissed to be taken seriously. Other apocryphal stories were swapped between school friends, which had him tramping roads abroad and odd jobbing at home. He was spotted in places as far apart as Caracas, Canberra, Cairo, Buenos Aires, St Ives, Brixton, and oddly, given that he would later move to Scotland, Fort William. The full truth about his lost years never fully emerged. Details sketchy. I never found out. Connie dropped only occasional hints, mostly vague. With the help of the overactive, underutilized imaginations of others, he'd allowed the construction of a mythic chimera around those down periods of his life, becoming for some a quixotic hero. This was Connie's only creative construction, undertaken from a distance, pulling the strings of various puppets so they might romanticize his life. I was never persuaded by the narrative. Inside the flat, panting after climbing the stairs while laden with bags, Connie carefully stacked their luggage in a corner by the living room door, pushing aside my furniture and a large rubber plant. Nice gaff, he grunted. Sit yourself down, he said, gesturing his wife towards one of my chrome-armed and ridiculously low tubular armchairs. Cheap 1970s imitation Bauhaus, crudely stitched and inexpertly upholstered with thick brown corduroy cloth, the rather rash handiwork of my ex-wife. He was as late as ever, I told Neris, a reproach to my old friend, while wondering if he truly deserved such an appellation. He kept me waiting. She'd just returned from work and still wore her unsexy nurse's uniform, a drab affair in blue nylon with white trim with spots of faded blood here and there. Her eyes were tired. Excuse me. Unavoidable, Connie commented in a slur. Delays on the tube. Well, hello, nursey. Having repeated this falsehood, he lurched towards Neris as if he were about to drunkenly molest her, the look upon his face grotesque. She stepped back instinctively. He'd never met her before, but that had always been his style, being one of those parasites who prey upon other people's women when there was trouble. He was always there at the end of a party, however late, ready to intervene if there were a hint of a disagreement or quarrel. Or he was guaranteed to turn up at the door of a female partner of any acquaintance who was rumoured to have separated from that friend. Connie having mulled over the loss with the guy the night before in the pub, apparently sympathetic, offering a ready ear as an act of brotherly solidarity over the guy's agony and loss. Connie was calculating in that way, in my opinion, although he would have claimed these episodes were all purely a matter of chance rather than a matter of deliberation. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. Any questions there? Something that struck me as well, Phil, is that you do not obsess, but you do seem to have a lot to say about the early 70s, as if it was a time that's vanished from Britain. Obviously, at the end of the decade, we have the election of Margaret Thatcher and the great changes. Is it something you're very conscious of, that you really do want to emphasize in your writing?
Well, yeah, because I mean, I grew up during that period of the 60s and 70s. I even got married during the 70s, and I was single still until the mid 70s, and then married, and then a young married person for the rest of the decade. And it is kind of weird. I mean, you get these programs, the 60s and 70s on TV now, National Geographic, which look at mainly American context, and I'm fascinated by the British equivalent, about which we don't say very much. When petrol was incredibly cheap, not as cheap as America, but still very cheap, when people held kind of hippie values, when there was a radical bookshop and an alternative bookshop and secondhand bookshops in every provincial town, poetry groups everywhere, creativity everywhere. Okay, a lot of it was crap probably, but it kind of buoyed people up. It gave an identity and a purpose to whole tranches of people, and its values were very kind of different in some ways. They were perhaps more naive, but quite open in some ways, and to the possibilities of self-expression, and you know, occasionally you get a kind of buoyancy of poetry in terms of fringe poetry or performance poetry, but back in the 60s and 70s, that kind of creativity was everywhere, in terms of art, in terms of writing, in terms of also maybe even just in terms of lifestyle, you know, communes. I mean, my next novel is going to be partly about a hippie commune. People trying alternative ways of being, ways of living that were very individualist, but I think some of it was deeply flawed as well. And I believe that a lot of the problems of our culture come from the flaws in those experiments. So that, yeah, it does fascinate me. Yeah, very much.
There's been a couple of questions actually, Phil. I've just learned how to use to access the chat option. So both Jadka, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, and Sarah have asked about the title of the book. So Jadka said, wondering about the title, what is the significance of the title?
Okay.
And Sarah said, what was the influence behind the title?
Okay, well, the premise behind the book, which is slightly different now to when it was first written, because the first draft of the book was written back in the early 90s. The premise of the book was that there's a kind of quasi-fascist government. And when I wrote it, John Major was the Prime Minister. And I had John Major instituting a quasi-fascist government with a kind of a crackdown on dissidents and various dissidents, and on any kind of rebellion or resistance. Because when I came back to look at this novel again, I found that rather unconvincing, because I just couldn't imagine John Major doing that, really. You know, sort of being so obsessed with cricket and the MCC and sort of mild-mannered. So that's where I got the notion of an alternative history, and of having Alan Clark as the Prime Minister in this alternative timeline. And of course, what he does, he, rather in the way they did in the Second World War with the overseas resistance in France and Europe, they create this kind of privatized security service that's full of thugs and criminals and people that brutalize others. And the two characters who Bill Tew encounters, who make his life initially difficult, are two people from this intelligence cohort, one of whom looks like a very aging brilliantine Clark Gable, and the other who has the girth and physical look, not the yellow, of a plastic duck. Hence the title, because he sort of Bill makes up these silly names in his head, but of course these people actually are really quite threatening. And then he later encounters Clark Gable again with another sidekick called the Teutonic Herman Munster, who inflicts a great deal of violence on him. But I don't want to give too much of the plot away, because it's a sort of thriller as well. What's going to happen to him, Bill Tew, as he's being victimized by this Central Intelligence Command, as it's called. It's a kind of special operations executive, you know, the overseas branch of Britain in the Second World War, inflicted on dissidents and others at home.
Yeah, it occurred to me that one has to be careful about explaining characters without giving away too much of the plot. So thanks for that, Phil. Yeah. You mentioned John Major and then Alan Clark, and of course, going back to that original question, John Major was a nice grammar school boy from a modest background, wasn't he?
Yes.
But you chose somebody from a more privileged background to be the more authoritarian, brutal prime minister instituting sort of martial law.
Yeah.
Was that intentional? You replaced Major with Clark?
Yes. Yeah, because I couldn't imagine John Major actually doing that. What happened was when I went back to the manuscript, I only had a paper copy, because this book would never have existed without the lockdown, because I was basically too bone idle to type it up. But when the lockdown came and I realized we were going to be stuck indoors for maybe 6 to 9 months with not much in the way of entertainment, I undertook the task of retyping it. And when I did that, I got this old manuscript and I rewrote it completely, root and branch. So the idea of having Alan Clark was something that I thought would explain this kind of, and in order to have Alan Clark as Prime Minister, how would that have happened? The only thing that would have fundamentally explained it, in my view, would be Thatcher losing the Falklands War. So again, the whole novel is predicated on the idea that Thatcher loses the Falklands War. And actually, when you research the background to the Falklands War, you only need about 3 or 4 things, maybe 5 separate elements to have changed. And they are significant elements, but they're not major ones. You know, Alexander Haig, as Secretary of State, tried to persuade Reagan to stop Britain from having such influence in the Americas. And if Reagan had followed and understood the Monroe Doctrine, he would have probably actually made it much more difficult for the British. If the French exercises had worked, and if the Russians, who were thinking about it, had allowed the latest surveillance apparatus that they had, if they'd have given that to the Argentinians, which were, again, they were considering, those 3 things alone, plus the major thing, the 4th thing, is the Argentinians were so convinced that how can I put it, that they were so convinced that a British Prime Minister would never send a task force, because to do so was an act of insanity, you know, a complete risk. So the decision was made not to extend the runway at Port Stanley for the airbase. Had they done that, they would have easily won the war. All they needed to do was take the risk seriously and they'd have won. But they just thought Britain would never send a task force, that it was a supreme act of folly and insanity, that's so much so that nobody sane would ever do it. Maybe that was Thatcher's strength. She was, to a degree, insane, and she did do it, you know. So,
Phil, a few questions are coming through on the chat now, so I'll read them, and maybe we could address them. Before I do, Jadka said she met you 15 years ago.
I saw that.
And has followed your career. And anyway, she's invited you to India.
Well, that would be nice. after the COVID lockdown, we're not even allowed out of London at the moment.
No. Question from David Simmons.
Yep.
Is his question whether your background in British academia was a help or a hindrance in envisaging a quasi-fascist state?
Oh, definitely a help. All you have to do is predicate a government that on the model of kind of management processes over the last 30 to 40 years in British universities. You know, with this, what I used to call the this conviction they have of the divine right of management. Once you've done that, I think if you kind of project that upon the country as a whole, it's a help, not a hindrance. Yeah. So the model is already there. You know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question then, from RI, and he picks up a good point, which I'm sure sort of strikes people really very firmly at the very beginning of the book, with the mention of the babes in the wood. Now, so we're talking about, actually, it's at the very beginning of the book where Phil's looking back on the year 1970, which was a really landmark year in his life. He did his O-levels, but all sorts of notable events occurred, which he might talk about briefly. But
of course, the character is not me; it's different.
Sorry,
character, yeah.
Bill Pugh. Yeah, Bill Pugh's life. But he,
It's
RI asks,
Raluca. Good afternoon, everybody.
Hello.
It's Raluca. I am.
oh, sorry, it's Raluca in Romania.
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody.
We are indeed global this afternoon.
Yes.
Nice
And
to hear from you, Raluca.
yes, I also made a typo. I apologize for it because of the typing. It's really difficult to follow and type at the same time.
That's fine.
So, just to address the question, what struck me with the novel, and you know that I read with like pen in hand, was that from the mention of the babes in the woods to the dramatic events that are, I'm not saying too much for whoever didn't
Don't
read
give
the
away
novel.
the ending. No.
Yes. There is a thread that makes me think about Hannah Arendt's banality of evil. So is that what you would say that you had in mind when you wrote? You remember I mentioned that this novel reminds me of
absolutely, because one of the most influential books on me in my early life when I was a student and in my 20s was Kurt Vonnegut's Mother Night, which is a book written after seeing the Eichmann trial and reading Arendt's book about the banality of evil. And Vonnegut, for all his flaws as a writer, I think captures that very well, that we are surrounded by what might be considered potential evil for much of our lives. And it's not always animated, but it often is. And going back to David's question, it always struck me that some of the people who manage institutions, I know they wouldn't like me to say it, to individualize this, so I'm not going to do so. But some of the people I've seen managing institutions, and I've worked for the GLC, I've worked for schools and colleges and universities and various other places. Some of them, in their attitude towards workers, and I can see why they get annoyed at some workers. I can see it myself. But nevertheless, they're only one step away from putting on a Gestapo uniform. You can absolutely see where the adherence to a fascistic state would come from, when you look at some of the bosses and section heads and the way they do things, that they rationalize them in a way that negates their common humanity. And we all do that, I think, to a degree. So it must be inherent within us. So we've all got that potential within us, I think. And I wanted to show how this kid, who grows up at the same time as my character, Bill Pugh, grows up at exactly the same time as Jim Dent, and he's modelled on a couple of other working class kids that at the time I thought they were goody two shoes. They were always polite and always well behaved and always did the kind of small c conservative thing, and I think perhaps for them, and that's the whole point of kind of developing the character of Bill Pugh, perhaps for them this banality of evil was even more shocking, because I was always a somewhat cynical child, somewhat kind of disapproving of others and doubtful. I think for the more naive child from that kind of background, it must have been truly shocking And of course, in Enfield, we did have this Babes in the Wood murder, which was a terrible, terrible, terrible killing. But also the way the perpetrator manipulated the situation for more than, I think it was about 28 years beyond their deaths, before the outcome was even known, having tried to implicate the parents of another child of whom he was friends and whose child he also murdered. And you realize the kind of, you know, that there is this kind of rotten quality to the world that often seems to, use a cliche again, but raise its awful ugly head. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On the
someone said about the
subject of the time span, Phil.
30 years. Yeah.
Jake, sort of wondered why it lay dormant for 30 years.
Okay, Jake. I was a really committed writer, a very committed writer, for a long, long time. From the age of about, well, I was a published poet. I published in regional and 1 or 2 national magazines. Not many, but I did publish poetry that was reasonably well regarded. I did readings. I did this right through from my late teens until my mid-20s. I attempted to write novels, and I wrote my first full novel, which I did nothing with, and I completed that in about 1979, maybe tweaking it in about 1980. And then I continued to write for the rest of the 80s, right through to the early 90s. And I didn't get anywhere. I couldn't publish fiction. I published a couple of short stories, but never a novella, not novella length, nor novel length. And in the end, I gave up because I decided it would be easier to be an academic and focus on less creative things in terms of my own practice, and become a critic rather than a writer. But having done that, I also, if you read Afterlives, it actually tells this story. I was also very close to Sue Townsend at one point in my life, who made it, who had a belief in me and a few other people as writers. And we never perhaps pursued it as comprehensively and as bravely as she did. And somehow when she died, it made me think very hard about mortality and the fact that if I want to fulfill that creativity, I haven't got forever to do it. And I decided I'd go back to writing, and I tried Afterlives very tentatively, actually. And I found that I enjoyed it. And then I went through all the old stuff I had, and I was convinced that some of it had a great deal of potential, but it was very, what I call clunky. It was unpolished, had bad parts, needed a lot more effort, which was something my younger self hadn't seen. I kind of half knew, but I just imagined that an agent or a publisher would say, "You're so fantastic, we'll come with us and we'll help you turn it into this brilliant novel that will create waves and everyone will be wowed and blown over by it." But of course, that never happened. So you know, it took far longer than it should have done, because my academic publishing career intervened, and that lasted for a long, long time, and I enjoyed that. So, is that unusual? I suppose it is probably unusual, but it is my story, I suppose. You know. So yeah.
Thanks, Phil. AL has a question, Phil. How would you say this book compares to the work you did on B.S. Johnson and Zadie Smith?
Well, all I can say is that both writers have been an influence upon me. Johnson stylistically and structurally, and Smith, I think, in terms of the exuberance that she brings to each writing project. and the fact that she sees it through and seems to me to be improving with every novel that she writes, and they become more thoughtful and more sophisticated. How's it compared to the work I actually did on them? I'm not sure how I mean, I suppose the same critical faculty has helped me understand where my own writing went wrong in earlier years. So by applying that knowledge, the knowledge of my, you might call them my critical years, my critical engagement, has helped me understand where I was going wrong and where I could rebalance the fiction I was writing. That's all I could say on that, really.
Good. Raluca has another question, Phil. Did you want to speak, Raluca, or shall I read it?
As you prefer. I'm absolutely fine. I mean, can read it. Okay.
In the vast majority of the novels dealing with Thatcher, her persona is always placed at the centre of the narrative. For example, Ian McEwan confessed all authors were obsessed with Thatcher. In your novel, you deal with her as merely a footnote. Is that a way to express resistance to her political and social legacy?
I say it's the opposite. I think in this alternative universe, there's a guy trying to write a book about how Thatcher might have won the Falklands War. So it's a kind of inversion of what I'm doing in my book. And I think once you understand that she's become a footnote in this alternative world, you realize how much, in geopolitical terms, the world was rebalanced by her intervention. Maybe not for the good, but I'm not going to make a judgment on that. I think just basically how profoundly she affected the kind of sense that the West could recover its some aspect of its hegemony, which I think was probably a grand illusion. You know, that by winning the Falklands, which, let's face it, doesn't really make much difference to anybody apart from ourselves and the Argentinians, didn't really change very much. But the West, and then you have this adventurism by Clinton and Blair, with what I consider a series of war crimes against Serbia, and that led to other interventions of a kind of more foolish and dangerous nature in the Middle East. So I think in a way it sort of it emphasizes how important she was, not necessarily in a positive way, but that everything she did seemed to signify one way or another. Yeah.
Okay. Khaled has asked, have you got an ideal or particular reader in mind when you're writing?
A reasonably intelligent one who's open-minded and that doesn't mind my slight small c conservatism, social conservatism, in terms of some values.
Yeah. Yeah, because some people might have been sort of surprised by what you said there about Serbia, but we won't turn it into a political.
No, I mean, that's just an opinion.
It's about your writing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll just say there's one person in the audience who appears in all of my books, but I don't know if he knows that.
It's not me.
No, not Pete.
I'm far too young. So I don't know if there's time really for another reading, Phil. What about the future?
Oh well, I did an academic book that I haven't published yet. I don't know whether it's ever going to get published, but I did loads of reading as in the background on the 1960s and 1950s and 60s, looking at drug culture and hippie culture and the kind of the whole cultural mores of the 60s, 50s, 60s, and maybe very early 70s, which I think I mentioned earlier really fascinates me. And I decided that I would write a book about somebody conceived in the summer of love, born the next year, and abandoned by his mother to a hippie commune. And I'm working my way through that at the moment. The guy is called Dylan Love, and he grows up in a commune which is just the other side of the border into Wales, but very near Ross-on-Wye. And he's trying to recover his past and find out what's happened to him and how the communal existence has shaped and reshaped or influenced him. And I'm in the process of research at the moment. And there's some fascinating things. There was a whole movement amongst certain hippie communes, for instance, in the mid-60s to about the mid-60s to late 60s, where they decided they would call all of their children across, this is more than one commune, they would call all of their children Wild. They'd all be given the same surname, the Wild children. So in my commune, all of the children are given the surname Love to reflect the kind of hippie notion of peace and love. So you've got all these communard siblings who all have the same name, Love, with a whole variety of, the hippies were quite inventive with children's names. So one is called Shiva Love, and she rechristens herself because, as kids do, they resist this sort of parental kind of silliness as the children see it. She rechristens herself Sharon. There's Denzel Love, who is Dylan himself, the protagonist. There's Amadeus Love, who becomes Andy Love and later a policeman, and various other Love children. So this is one of the central concepts to the novel. And I'm looking at the idea of how the 60s may have damaged a whole generation of children with its utopianism, and just seeing where those ideas go. I've got it kind of mapped out pretty much, but I'm open to the thing mutating. So yeah. Whoa.
Oh, things have happened. There are a couple more questions, Phil, which we could try to squeeze in, but Sarah asked how she could get a signed copy of your book.
Well, I could sign one and give it to you, and she could order one. Yes, but it would take a little while, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Can she communicate with you through email?
Yeah, via Brunel. Yeah, definitely.
Sarah, so I hope that answers your question. If you'd like a signed copy, if you speak to Phil, we can sort it out.
Have I ever based a novel character on one of my Brunel students? No, not yet. But I have based it on students elsewhere. There are one or two characters based on students I've met elsewhere.
I nearly said George Dent. George Tew, who you obviously know, has asked a question about Jim Dent.
Yeah, go
on. Is it the same Jim Dent as in your previous work, or an alternative reality version?
It's definitely an alternative reality, Jim Dent. It allows me to explore the more negative sides and amplify those of my character. So yeah, it's not the Jim Dent, the nice Jim Dent we had in Afterlives and Fragmentary Lives. This is a slightly more aggressively devious Jim Dent.
So just on that, would Bill Pugh forgive you today?
Me, yeah, he'd forgive me if it was the real me, yes. But he wouldn't forgive the alternative Jim Dent. No, never. He never will.
Right. So can I, if unless anybody else has got anything further to add or say, I think people are saying thank you, and it's time to do other things. But thank you everybody for attending this launch of Clark Gable and his plastic duck, and thanks particularly to Seb Jenner for organising. If you're interested in obtaining a copy, the easiest thing is to go to the Brigand website. It's www.brigand.london. But of course, if you want a signed copy, if you communicate directly with Phil, and then we can somehow get that copy to you. Phil, anything else to add from yourself?
No, just thanks for everyone for coming. It's really kind of them to participate, and I hope they enjoyed it. Well, thank you, everyone, and do try and read the book. And I'd love to have feedback, because, you know, one can only improve.